I'm going to introduce Don Sellers, who I'm positive needs no introduction to most of it. So Don Don grew up in Southport, and by the age of 6, he was an avid aviator, schooled by his lifetime hero. That he'll tell you about that. He flew helicopters in Vietnam. He flew Manhattan, spotter planes up and down the coast, and did that to guide hoagie boats to where the Manhattan were schooling. He was then 20 years a pilot for Piedmont Airlines. And oh yes, he authored his memoir called When Dreams Took Flight. It's a great read. He was actually, I didn't have to think of anyone else. He was the first person that came to my mind for the presentation of this topic. His background in aviation, plus as 12 or 13-year-old young
12.
Man, all right, did a lot of he had a lot of interest in the Bolivia aircraft, and he and his lifetime hero worked together on it. So let me introduce Donald Sellers and Cindy Sellers.
Thank you, Bob. The Historical Society has lots of newspapers and articles and information on the website where you can research everything, just about everything I'm going to tell you in depth. Only difference is I'm going to tell you what I know about the crash of National Airlines 2511 on January 6, 1960. I was 12 years old at the time, but I remember an awful lot about it and the investigation as I was there with it. And I have researched documents, endless documents, to support everything I'm getting ready to tell you right now. So you need to know that aviation became my life's blood on the birthday of 5 years old when I took my first airplane ride with Hall Waters, a Wilmington man, fish spotter. He was the true legend who figures very heavily in this story. This investigation was my first experience of understanding how deadly aviation could be. I feel like my expertise on this report stems from the fact that I have over 30,000 hours of pilot and command time in an airplane. And I want to tell you one more thing ahead of time here, that there's a lot in this conversation which is pretty graphic, and I just want you to know that it's graphic in nature, but it's all factual. The flight from New York to Miami was originally scheduled to be a Boeing 707, and it was to depart Idlewild, which now is JFK, January the 6th at 9:30 at night. There was a mechanical with this airplane, and they had to pull it off the line. Apparently, a front windscreen had cracked, and it was found during pre-flight. So National Airlines pulled this airplane aside, pulled it back, pulled it off the jetway, and brought 2 other airplanes up there to carry this 100+ people. One of them was Lockheed Electra, a 4-engine turboprop. They were fairly new on the line. And the other one was a Douglas DC-6B. So they pulled these airplanes to the gate, and it's first come, first serve. Getting on board, Lockheed wound up at, I think, 76 passengers, and it departed around 11:34 out of Kennedy or Idlewild for Miami, and arrived safely. Second airplane, the DC-6, was loaded at the same time while it taxied right out behind it, and it departed roughly the same time, just a few minutes later. It had 29 passengers, 5 crew members, had a pilot and a co-pilot, or a captain and first officer, as they're known now, a flight engineer, and 2 stewardesses, now known as flight attendants. Route of flight was to take it out of Idlewild down the East Coast, last checkpoint, Carolina Beach, excuse me, where the last communication was heard from this airplane. At this point, this airplane was to take up a 200-degree heading and fly directly Miami from Carolina Beach. And it's a little, anyway, we'll get to it. 200, right here, 200 degrees heading out of Cape Fear, direct Miami. It maintained normal contact all during the flight path. The final radio communication was with the company radio in Wilmington at 2:31 a.m., where they reported over the Wilmington VOR at 227, which sits just north of Wilmington, and VOR stands for Visual Omni Range, which is a means of telling this airplane exactly where I am over the ground. They were at 18,000 feet. And 4 to 5 minutes later, they reported over at Carolina Beach Beacon, which, when it was in operation, was the strongest beacon in the world, and that stands for automatic direction finding. And it was used extensively for airlines up and down the coast overseas. They were on a heading of 200 degrees, which had taken them out over the ocean direct to Florida. And their last transmission said, "All is well." All is well. Mr. Richard Randolph at his farm in Bolivia, just west of there, 15, 20 miles, heard something like an explosion at around 2:30 so in the morning. And he went outside. He didn't see anything. He was a farmer. My dad and I have quail hunted on his land many times when I was a little boy. But regardless, he didn't see anything. He just heard a hell of a racket, but he went back into his house and went to bed. Fishermen at Curry Beach heard an explosion they listed at 2:30. Now, bear in mind, this is well back over the ocean where the airplane was at. Mr. Randolph's son went out about 7 o'clock the next morning and discovered wreckage in the field. And not knowing what it was, but it looked like it could have been something to do with an airplane. Came in and told his dad. His dad went out there and looked, and obviously it was parts of an airplane, and he notified I'm not sure who he notified, but soon after, the Highway Patrol, Sheriff's Departments, Civil Air Patrol, FBI, everybody was there to start initiating a search for survivors. All they knew, they had an airplane, that's all they knew. And it covered a big area of his farm. Now, I'm gonna give you my analysis of what happened to this airplane. And I'm kind of getting ahead here, but it'll fall into place as I talk about it. The plane entered a right-hand turn after the explosion over Carolina Beach. And I say Carolina Beach, actually it's west of Carolina Beach. It's just south of Sunny Point is where the beacon's at. Well, the beacon is just north of, or straight across the river from Sunny Point, should I say. Entered a right-hand turn after the explosion, which left a huge 10 by 10 hole in the fuselage. Now, this was an explosion followed by a rapid decompression, which has the same effect of blowing out. This added significant, what's known as parasitic drag on the right side of the airplane. And parasitic drag in aviation terms means that you've now taken a smooth airfoil, a smooth laminar airfoil, and all of a sudden roughed it up with metal and twisted, and debris, and now this is going to cause a drag on this airplane. It's going to force it to the right to some extent. Even with the engines running, I believe the plane simply could not hold together under the stress of flying with major airframe damage, and it broke up in the air. It was a catastrophic failure of the airplane. This would have caused loud noises, but no further explosions. Residents in the area said they heard two, some said they heard 3 different explosions about the same time Mr. Randolph heard one. But they couldn't put it together. They said it was a sound they couldn't really describe. It was just unusual. They didn't know what, but it was something going on. They couldn't figure it out. I also believe the pilots made an amazing effort to turn the plane back to the right and try to get it back north to Wilmington. I think the drag and also the fact a right-hand turn would have put it back to Wilmington Airport quicker than a left-hand turn, which would have carried it offshore and back around. But it was too much, too little, and too late. The airplane came apart and disintegrated over Bolivia in the Randolph farm. Now I'm going to tell you why I think it disintegrated, because no other explosions are mentioned. Well, no other explosions were proven later on during the investigation. The only explosion mentioned was over Carolina Beach. This aircraft had just experienced a tremendous explosion, a pressurization issue, which almost had blown the number 3 engine. Now the engine sequence go from the left side 1, 2 to inside the fuselage to the right number 3, outboard number 4. This explosion this aircraft had almost blown the number 3 engine off the wing. And the crew could see this. They could see this engine out there just beating and cramming and flopping and trying to tear itself all to hell. It was just a mess. And they could see this going on at the cockpit. And they knew it was going to break free. Their only recourse in this was to shut that engine down. That's the first thing that they got to do. They've had a bad explosion and so forth, but they also know they're looking out the window what's going on. The other engines are fine, but this one engine is just going crazy out there, and it's vibrating and shaking the plane relentlessly. So they got to shut it down. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about shutting an engine down. Under normal circumstances, and I'm sure you all have seen movies, or aviation movies, or maybe war movies or whatever, so forth, where the comment, we got to feather an engine. We need to feather an engine, and we're going to feather the engine before they shut the airplane down. Maybe oil pressure is lost. Maybe a zillion reasons why you need to feather this engine. Well, these guys didn't really have that option. In doing so, you've got one control called a throttle. And this throttle works just like an automobile accelerator pedal. You push it forward, you go fast, you pull it back, you slow down. That's pretty simple. The center lever is normally, on a lot of airplanes, it's painted gray or painted blue, the throttle black. Not always, and I'm not sure on this one if it's blue. I don't even know where that throttle lever is on this particular airplane, or the prop control governor. But anyway, so that's the one that's painted blue. Okay, now we're going to feather this prop in order to shut the engine down. And you do this because if you don't feather the prop, which in turn puts the propeller angle as such where the angle is perfectly in line with the forward motion of the airplane. If it were turned and the blade as normal in flying, now you've got a big wind resistance trying to turn that propeller. And this in turn puts unbelievable amount of drag on the airplane, and the other engines, as a rule, can't overpower that. So these blades have got to be feathered or turned perfectly in line with the wind, with the slipstream. It's like a rudder. So that's the purpose of this number 2 lever. Well, then the third one you have is a mixture control. Now, this lever is painted red, or the knob is red, and bear in mind, everything on an airplane in a cockpit that's painted red is red for one reason. It means a warning, it means danger, it means some emergency device. It's all bad, nothing good about painted red in the airplane, in the cockpit. So this is the mixture control, and this is a control that they were to take and pull back. This shuts the fuel off to the engine, is all that one lever does. Theoretically, this is supposed to stop everything. And then you have other controls up top. You know, you got a switch you flip to shut the hydraulics off, to shut hydraulic pumps on the engine off that may be running hot, causing overheat. You got a switch up here for electrical to disconnect what's called a CSD, or constant speed drive, which isolates the generator, which is producing thousands of volts. It takes that offline. You're eliminating the problem of heat or maybe fire. You got a switch, if I didn't mention it, of bleed air. What this does, it closes all the exhaust ports on this engine and fuselage, and it prevents hot air from that engine coming inside the cabin, which is used for protection in ice. As a general rule, this hot air goes down the leading edge of the wing on the inside, and it melts the ice and it falls off in the tail. And in some cases, it's used for heat in the cockpit also. Well, then the last one they have is a CO2 bottle. And this is indicated by on the console itself, as we can see right here, 1, 2, 3, 4. If there's a fire in number 3 engine, or if there's any malfunction in number 3 engine to necessitate firing this bottle, this will light bright red, and it flashes. And also there's an audible horn that will tell you fire, and you can't shut it off unless you hit a particular switch to silence it. Well, so they are now down to looking at this. That's flashing in front of them. It probably started flashing immediately when the only explosion went off. And it only required a little over 4 minutes to fly from the explosion until this airplane completely disintegrated. So they were first off faced with a catastrophic decision of pressurization problem, which decompression blew out, but they're only at 18,000 feet, so it wasn't all that critical for oxygen. I think you can probably live 20 minutes or a little longer if you're at only 18,000 feet. There's just enough oxygen there to keep you going. Well, so that wasn't their concern. Their concern was this engine is beating and cramming out here and trying to literally tear this airplane apart. So the first thing they do, they look at that fire handle, which is bright red, and they pull it. Well, the wonderful part about a fire handle as such, that one handle takes care of everything. If I'm going to shut this engine down, as I just discussed, under normal situations of a warning or an overtemp in oil, a loss of oil pressure, we need to shut this engine down and secure it. Happens quite often in airplanes. Well, this fire handle, when you pull it, you've armed the bottles, and when you rotate it to the left, you fire the left-hand bottle into that engine. Now, this is CO2, heavily condensed, and what it does, it will muffle, takes the place of any plain oxygen going into it, stifles the engine out, it can't get air, shuts it off. And it's fired internally in the intake of the engine and also between the engine and the nacelle, the cowling around this engine. So it isolates the fire. If that light quits blinking, you're good to go. If that light continues to blink, you now rotate it to the right and fire the second bottle. And hopefully that'll take care of it. And if it doesn't, well, you're on a mess. That handle also, the one good part about it, when you pull it and activate that handle, you're doing everything I just mentioned earlier. You're cutting off the hydraulics, electrics, the bleed, everything. Everything is done in one quick sweep, pow, and it's all done instantly. And this is in an emergency. And whenever you, as a general rule, in most aircraft, heavy aircraft, not always because some are designed differently, when you activate that handle, it cannot be reset. You've pulled it for one reason. It says fire, it says emergency, it says you're in a hell of a mess. You've got to do this. And so it can't be reset for flight. Well, that wasn't their issue. They pulled that handle and nothing happened. It fired the bottles. It did like it's supposed to do. The bottles in the investigation showed empty. The handle showed it had been twisted left and right. One other thing they did, and I almost forgot to mention, they followed the checklist to the T. Now remember, they only got 4 or 5 minutes before these guys are dead, but they followed it to the T, which included activating a switch here, of which I have, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, just a little bit, but it's, this switch drops all the oxygen mask in the fuselage in the back, in the passenger compartment. It's called an override, oxygen override. Now it's guarded, it's got safety wire. The housing is safety wired down where you can't just in the middle of the night reach up there and accidentally hit this switch and drop it. That's what's commonly known in airline as dropping the rubber jungle. You can't do that. You know, there's no spaghetti of mask hanging down. You got to physically, I want to open that and drop this mask. This is an emergency, lack of oxygen. So you have to break the seal and then hit the toggle switch. Those guys did that. They were still on a checklist, and that obviously they were in a disaster mode, and the only thing we know to do is if everything else fails, follow the checklist, and that's what they did. So now time's approaching the field. They're still looking out the window. The engine is running wild just like it was. Nothing has changed. All 4 engines are still, nothing has been altered. They pulled a fire handle on the engine that they see that's about to tear off from this wing, and nothing's happened. It's still running. It's still running as if good to go, but it's beating and framming, and it's vibrating, and it's shaking this plane so bad that things are falling off the ceilings and everything. Well, the investigation will later turn up and show that when all 4 engines impacted, when all 4 engines did their damage and they hit the ground, they all were turning, if I'm not mistaken, it was, here it is, 2,240 RPMs, which is on an R2800, which is a tremendous radial, 2,800 cubic inches, 2,500 horsepower. All 4 engines were set at 2,240. That's what they were turning, which meant at no point in time did the pilots try to retard throttles, try to slow the airplane down, try to get a little lower because of altitude. They needed to get down to 12,000 feet, but only being at 18, they were okay for a few minutes. They had time to activate the oxygen mask. This tells me that they had much more to worry about than pulling the throttles back on that airplane and trying to slow it down. This airplane was in dire straits. It was totally shaking itself to pieces. The number 3 engine on this airplane, the one that the explosion initially caused the problem, was one that was on fire when the wing separated from the fuselage. When this engine tore loose, it was coming forward, leaving the wing behind it. It was advancing, but it was pulling everything else that it was attached to with it. propeller marks on the side of the fuselage showed this. It showed every time a prop blade, and now bear in mind, the propeller is only this far from the side of the fuselage on the inboard engines. And that engine only had to pivot just slightly, and that prop's going to hit the fuselage. Well, every time a blade came through, the marks advanced forward. This engine was literally coming out of its mounts. And it did. This engine is the only portion of the wreck, the only portion. Wasn't another nut, bolt, screw, a piece of wire, or anything which clearly showed evidence of excessive heat and fire. Now, the reason when these pilots pull this fire handle and nothing happened, well, they don't have time to sit back and let's talk about it. Now what we're going to do, they're fighting that as hard as they can. I imagine, I haven't seen it quite like this, but I've seen vibrations so bad you couldn't see, you couldn't focus on the instrument panel. And I'm sure they had it 10 times worse than that. The reason being nothing worked on this fire control system was because the initial explosion, which happened slightly behind the base of that engine, almost the same level with it, blew out into the wing and across the firewall of this engine, and it severed all controls. There were no controls left to work. This engine was now running on gasoline with no reason to stop. It was just nothing. You couldn't do anything with it. It's basically a runaway engine. Well, as that engine pulled off, it was just a matter of seconds before the other engine running full power, outbound wing, outboard, pulled the wing forward and finished ripping the wing clean off the fuselage. And this left a huge gaping hole in the side of the fuselage. The entire right side was opened up. You couldn't have taken anything and opened it up any prettier, exposing everything and everyone inside. As soon as that right wing came off, here's the killer. The other two engines are running max power or normal operating power. Everything was normal operating power, or as it was listed, economical cruise power for long range. They're going long range to Miami. 5,000 horsepower out on this left wing is still doing its job, pulling as hard as it can. And now the right wing has nothing, there's nobody over here. And so what's it going to do? It creates a tremendous spinning cycle on this fuselage. And this fuselage goes into rapid spinning. That's what threw the passengers out. They were scattered everywhere, all over the farm. Coffee cups scattered everywhere, still had residue of coffee in them. Everything in that cockpit went out, and it went out because it was slung out. No explosion, it was slung out. Several people on and near the farm reported hearing 2 and 3 explosions. Well, I'm not saying they didn't, but what I think they actually heard was the aircraft breaking apart in flight. The sounds of, at night, dead silence, the sounds of twisting metal and thrashing, and you can't believe it. That makes a sound you just can't describe what it sounds like, and they couldn't describe it. What they actually heard, as I say, was the airplane breaking apart and hitting the ground. Now, there's one other thing here. This particular engine, the R2800, is very well known. When there's an interruption of fuel supply going to this engine in any manner, if any pressure is lost just briefly, these huge engines go to backfiring, and you can hear them 5 miles away. I've heard them so many times in cranking them and trying to start them at local airports and all. A fuel disruption, for whatever reason, this engine, hell, that goes to backfiring. Bam, bam, and you can just hear it forever. I'm thinking that's what they heard. It's just me. In fact, the final report shows there was no evidence of any explosions near the farm or in the debris field and on any of the bodies or any of the wreckage found anywhere else. And bear in mind, this aircraft was scattered well over a mile square area. Central portion of the fuselage was in the farm, in the field where Mr. Randolph lived. Bodies were scattered, just completely scattered. In order to do that, it's going to either take an explosion, of which there wasn't one, or it's going to take centrifugal force of spinning and slinging them, and that's what happened. Some of the bodies were, well, let me back up. The pattern of debris field on and around the Randolph farm indicated the aircraft totally disintegrated in flight. And it did, and it came drifting straight down, of which it did. There was not any indication on this airplane anywhere of forward movement when it hit the ground. Some sections were found nestled in among small pines, a real small area of pines, and there would be a seat here or a piece of metal here, and no damage on a tree anywhere around it. That piece of metal floated straight down. No indications at all, as I said, of forward flight. The main fuselage was in the middle of his farm, the biggest portion of it. The cockpit section, which was broken off, was found fairly close by. In the cockpit, one of the pilots was still strapped to his seat, and his wristwatch was still running. At this, it was 9:35 in the morning. Then the main fuselage, what was left of it, it was pretty much intact except being opened on the right-hand side and being crumpled. The tail section was a short ways off. The wings, one of the left-hand wing or the right-hand wing, which came off first, was located 2,500, 2,000. How far?
They're all about 2,000 feet.
Okay, 2,000 feet from the main portion of the fuselage, and the number one engine or the number three engine, which broke off, was buried straight down beside it in a deep hole, mud. Then the wing, and then the other engine was close by. Then the fuselage, and the other wing is located in a different area, but it's roughly 2,000 feet away. It was as if it was a pendulum. It was doing the swinging of that fuselage, and in essence, that's what it did. And then it broke off. Scattered all around the field were bodies. It was just a terrible scene. Some of the bodies had their arms up over their head as if they were trying to ward off some impending disaster, something. It was something. They were trying to stop it. Some of the bodies had Mae West on, and they had the Mae West on prior to this development, prior to this explosion. They knew they were going out over the ocean because it was obvious. They looked out the window. But at the time, it was overcast, but they all knew at Wilmington is where possibly the pilots would make the announcement, you know, folks, we're coming up on Carolina Beach now. We'll be going direct Miami over the ocean. It's going to put us 150 miles off Charleston. Have a good trip. Sit back and go to sleep. Well, a lot of them had Mae West on. It had been raining, and many of them were partially buried in the mud. And everybody was found drifting down as if he was in a parachute. And the bodies mainly were intact. They weren't mutilated from a disaster such as an explosion. And the part that is really so odd is just a few minutes prior, just 5-6 minutes at the most, the pilots had just reported all is well. As I mentioned, when the engine pulled free, it continued to run, leaving prop marks along the fuselage. The wing was torn away, pulling everything it could with it, leaving a huge gaping hole in the belly. It was a total disaster. I never went out there to it, but I got to see the rest of it. going to talk about the morgue in Southport. A friend of mine, L.B. Bennett, who I hunted and fished with basically all my life, played sports with, his dad was a coroner, the only coroner in Brunswick County at that time. His name was Lowell Bennett, Sr. Great guy. He made the statement, it's the worst day of his life. He arranged to move the bodies to the gymnasium here in Southport. Now, you got to remember back then, this is a little town, 2,000, maybe 2,500. I don't think over 25. Maybe my good friend Tommy Harrelson could know more about the population in 60, but.
Even less.
So there you have it. It wasn't many people here in this little town. One gymnasium, which is still here. This was made into a makeshift morgue. There were 32 bodies in this morgue. 2 are still missing. FBI pathologists came to Southport to work with the corpse. Local doctors, nurses, dentists assisting. It was a stressful time for such a little town. The gym was filled with 32 bodies, and workers could barely find time to take a break. Everybody worked around the clock, according to this Southport pilot little thing I'm reading. In the meantime, volunteer firemen, Coast Guardmen, Highway Patrol, Brunswick County Sheriff Department personnel, airline personnel, everybody wanted to come help. Everybody wanted to be a part of it, and everybody was so helpful. Well, they've got to be fed, and this is where the city of Southport, or the personnel of Southport, came together. The townspeople stepped up, and they handled that task. They fed everyone. They did everything they could. According to the January 13th issue of the Southport Pilot, I quote, "Thursday was the rough day." I remember it just taken place the day before. Relatives arrived by the dozens. National Airlines had made accommodations for these people in local motels in Wilmington with the idea of them staying there until they were needed to come for identification or for whatever, until they were needed for an interview. And they would come to Southport only as a last resort for identification, because this was a mess. It didn't work. These people didn't come all the way from New York and as far down as Cuba to sit in a motel with their loved ones only 30 miles away in Southport. So down they came. All the local residents tried their best to console everyone. And I just can't reiterate once again what a mess this was. They tried to feed them, reassure them that the work of identification was going as quickly as possible, and explain to them how they couldn't all go into the gym and start pulling off blankets. There were many emotional breakdowns, some cases of hysterics, but by 8 p.m., the larger group of relatives had departed. Now, this is Thursday. By midnight, Thursday night, only 5 bodies remained unidentified. By Friday afternoon, 32 had been identified. There were still 2 bodies missing. One is a Connecticut lawyer by the name of Julian Frank, and the other a banker from Cuba, a Carlos Valdez. Valdez will be found on Thursday, January the 14th, on the Randolph farm, buried so deeply in the mud that it's a wonder they found him to begin with. Now we'll focus on Mr. Frank. And now the investigation begins. And suddenly this is where I get involved, because the pilot that found Mr. Frank was my hero. Taught me to fly, took me flying with him, and I was with him every step of the day I could. Here's a photo of Hall and his brothers. Hall is in the dark jacket right there. He flew in the military. To his left is his brother's son, who is a well-known welding instructor at Cape Fear Tech. to Hall's immediate right was his brother Robert Waters, who was a fish spotter along with Hall at Brunswick Navigation, where I met them at. And I flew with Robert occasionally. I was supposed to have had my very first airplane ride with Robert. And my parents were cooks at this factory, and they cooked for all these huge amount of men, 50, 60 men, 3 meals a day that supported the Menhaden business. And they would come in every morning for breakfast. And I was so excited. It was my birthday, and I thought maybe I might get to go ride in an airplane. I didn't know. But Robert was going to take me. And at that time, I didn't know the difference between Robert and Hall, and I didn't know which one I liked the best. I liked them both, man. They were pilots. Hell, that's all I wanted. Well, we were getting ready to go out the door, and Hall said, said mother and dad, I don't know what it was. And next thing I know, he said, come on, Don, I got you, let's go. So I go with him. And I can't tell you, I don't remember anything about it. I was so happy. A couple of days later, or 3 or 4 days later, Robert took me flying, and he scared the living hell out of it. Yeah, we flew to, seemed like me, it was 10,000 feet. I know it was. And he said, can you see those cars down there? I couldn't even see the ground. I said, yeah. And then he'd take the control yoke, and I'm doing this, and I said, if I can ever get out this airplane. That's how bad he scared me. And I flew with him a few more times. He never scared me, but he was always up some kind of prank. Hall, I literally have flown thousands of hours with him in the back seat of that airplane also, the one I soloed, by the way. He never, ever once scared me. Never once. He just he put me under his wing, and here we go. The other guys to Robert's right is a guy called Punky Curie. Now, I flew with him occasionally when he was based up here, not too often, but some. As a little boy, I flew with whoever would carry me flying. I didn't care who it was. And they'd land, the first thing I'd do is try to gas the plane up for them or clean the windscreen or try to act like I was wanting a ride. And I'd fly with him. I can, to this day, sitting in the back seat flying meant so much to me. I could close my eyes and tell you who I was flying with just from the smell coming from up front. Everybody had a little distinct odor. Everything about the airplane was a little different. Anyway, Punky's grandfather, Hans Curie, was the original owner of Curie Beach. So he's a local guy too. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about finding the body. On January morning, on a January morning the 9th, which was on a Saturday, Hall and his brothers decided to go flying and try to find this missing man, Julian Frank. Now, bear in mind, the other guy hadn't been found yet, but they're trying to find anything that'll tell them why this airplane, what happened. No one had the idea of it. Why it disintegrated. Everybody knew, the authorities, everybody knew it just was a mess everywhere. A statement was made later by someone, I don't recall who, said, if anybody can find this missing man, I promise you those Waters men can do it. I'm going to read to you from the Wilmington News article written by writer Jim Hardy, which is published on January 15th. A clue to the solution of the mystery surrounding the crash of National Airlines DC-6B January 6 near Bolivia was apparently provided by the finding of the body of Julian Andrew Frank in Snow's Marsh near Sunny Point. And there's a little map. Snow's Marsh right there. And you can see the Fort Fisher Ferry coming down, and this is where the Fort Fisher Ferry docks, straight across, and this is at the mouth of Walden Creek, right here. And I've got a lot of time in that area fishing. As a matter of fact, two of my fishing buddies, Jim and Judy Nelson, have fished with me many times there. It's an unusual place, as you can't get out of a boat there because the mud is endless. You can be in water 6 inches deep and step out and you're gone. Anyway, some 15 miles from the crash site of the main crash was Hall Waters. He said it was just luck that I saw his body. I doubt seriously if he would have been found if it hadn't been for sheer luck. This guy landed in the marsh. Only the marsh kept him from settling out of sight. Anyway, Hall and his brother Robert, both fish spotters for the Menhaden Fleet in Southport, had taken off at 8:50 Saturday morning. They flew first to the site of the wreckage in Bolivia, and then from there they flew due east to the Cape Fear River. They reached the river just north of Orton Plantation, which is just north of Sunny Point. We decided to check along the riverbank, Hall related. Robert flew the east bank, I flew the west bank. And then we turned and both flew south along the water's edge. He explained that each time they came to an island in the river, and there were many of them, they would first circle it, crisscross it, and just give it a thorough look over for anything the tide had washed up, anything unusual. And anyway, they'd flown from Pleasant Oaks Plantation, just north of Sunny Point, to Sunny Point before they spotted anything. Here, they found what appeared to be pieces of aluminum, small pieces of aluminum, something shiny. Later found out it was insulation from inside the airliner. Moving on along the riverbank, they came to the mouth of Walden Creek. And that's where Hall came across the second find of the day. James Waters, Hall's brother, sitting in the back seat. And the passenger saw some seats in a shallow slough on the north end of the small island. A little gut like it cuts through, makes a little island out there off the main island. Hall climbed back up and radioed the control tower at Blumenthal Field. They in turn radioed a Marine helicopter, which came down. And initially, the helicopter tried to blow the seats off the marsh out into the mud where they could get to it. They didn't know it was mud, and that was just hard sand. They were going to land on it. But that didn't work. All it did was just bury the seats down deeper. The next move, they contacted the Cape Fear Civil Air Patrol Squadron at Fort Fisher. The helicopter was advised to pick up CAP members S. Warren Sanders, an operations officer, and a guy called Quincy Futch, who had a small rescue boat. They loaded the two guys in the boat on board the helicopter and flew them back over to where the seats were. The copter transported Sanders, Futch, and the rescue boat to the site where the seats were located. Meanwhile, a Coast Guard boat has been dispatched to the site. Hall said, I was circling the island waiting for them to remove the seats when James, once again in the back seat, saw some seagulls further south picking at something on the beach. Hall dropped down for a closer look, and not far from the seagulls, he saw the body. It was face up, just barely into the marsh, not on the mud, but barely into the marsh. He said the body was 300 yards from the seats. The body was in a watery marsh on the island. It couldn't have washed up there, Hall said. Well, naturally, it couldn't have. No tides that high. It was thrown there. He said, I've spotted many bodies before and never seen one wash face up. So I've seen the wave action, and I've seen this wave action on a body on the beach will turn it over, flip it over, arms, whatever, but never face up. So the Coast Guard were having a very difficult time removing the body of Frank from the mud, and that the Sanders and Futch came over and they all helped get him on board the helicopter. New Hanover County Coroner Gordon Doran was summoned to Fort Fisher where the body was then taken by a helicopter to a hospital in Wilmington. It was nude, the body was nude with the exception of a necktie, a shirt collar, and a belt. Now, does that tell you how strong that blast was? The only thing left is his collar. and a part of a necktie and a belt. Asked if the body bore any marks of a possible explosion. He said, it was so muddy and dirty, I just couldn't tell. But I didn't see any signs of burns anyway. While at the hospital, James Walker Memorial Hospital, a government pathologist performed an autopsy. Wilmington dentist Bobby Russ did an impression of the teeth. Later, the remains were moved to Andrew Mortuary, where they were eventually shipped to Riverside Memorial Chapel in New York City. Now, Hall is through with this part of the inspection. And I was out in the backyard at my house. I was probably getting ready to go quail or squirrel hunting or something. I don't know what I was doing. But anyway, he flew up to the little grass strip on the Southport, on the Fish Factory Road, where Big Boy Toy Storage is located, was the grass strip that we flew out of. It's been long gone, of course. Landed there and taxied up the highway across from Clem Seafood. If you guys, any of you know about Clem Seafood, stopped, got out, walked across the highway to my parents' house and used the phone. Well, I was out of school that day and I didn't know anything about it. I happened to come in the house as Hall's in there talking on the phone, and I was floored. Here he is flying, and I got to say, I remember it real distinctly, because I wasn't flying with him, and I was totally disgusted. I was. It was bad. Anyway, so now we've got the newly found 33rd body of Julian Frank, who'd come under suspicion even before he had been found. And it had become quite obvious that the crash resulted from an explosion, which would yet have to be proven. The Earth airplane is just destroyed, but they really don't know why yet. He was a New York attorney who lived in Westport, Connecticut with his wife, who was a model. They had 2 children. And it surfaced about the same time that he had taken out a large insurance policy just prior to departure. Actually, there were other policies he'd taken out that year in large sums. But a quote out of the New York Times stated that it wasn't unusual for very wealthy people to take out policies as such. The investigation soon found out, though, that he was in dire financial trouble, which included lawsuits against him. Now the investigation begins of rebuilding the plane. The CAB, or Civil Aeronautics Board, which then is now replaced by the NTSB, or National Transportation and Safety Board, they wanted to put this airplane together. They yet didn't have an answer what happened. They wanted to put it together if they could and try to determine. Well, they worked out a deal with Hall. He had a huge hangar in Wilmington, as you can see. They worked out a deal with him to assemble this airplane as best they could around a large wooden frame. And they covered this frame in what's known as chicken wire, large mesh wire. And what they were going to do was cover that wire, every piece that went where it was supposed to go, like a puzzle, until they assembled that airplane in that hangar. And hope they would determine what the cause was. They started with a wooden frame in the shape of fuselage and covered it with chicken wire. The pieces of the plane in all sizes, from a car door to a pie plate and even smaller, were brought to Wilmington, and I remember seeing them dump it out in dump trucks. And these pieces were identified and meticulously secured to the chicken wire, just like a puzzle, until this fuselage was complete. And it's amazing how complete it was. In fact, I think we have a picture of that. Or do we? Yeah, here we are. Now, this is the left side of the fuselage. Now, I know that doesn't look like much of an airplane, but from here forward is the cockpit section. And here's the fuselage going back. And right here is the base of a wing, and the engine comes out here. Well, the left side was pretty much identifiable as an airplane. The right side, all was gone. But but they had the pieces to put it there, but they didn't assemble it because obviously it was torn apart, and it showed a major disaster of some sort. It was assembled in such a way that you could actually identify what you were looking at. I know that's a DC-6. That's how well it was put together. And if you see these little steps right here, I was there every day, I think, at the school. Mother or Daddy one would carry me over there and watch them assemble this airplane. And it was just fascinating to me. And I would get on these steps, and Hall always said, you can't do that. I'd get on these steps and climb up just to look in that cockpit. I can't recall a whole lot about the cockpit other than there was one seat I do know in there, and I just wanted to reach over and touch something. I wanted to be part of this thing. Well, anyway, I never did. He kept me out of it. There was a section of the fuselage that was missing on the right side. Now, they put this airplane together. I'm telling you, it's unbelievable how it's put together. They even matched up rivets, rows of rivets that come together. They weren't assembled like that. They were matched up. And if there was a piece missing, it was missing. But anyway, there was a section of the fuselage missing on the right side, and it was incorporated in with the leading edge of the wing and right on down the wing. They had that portion because it tore off with the wing. But there was a section, about a 10-foot square section that I mentioned earlier that was just missing. They didn't have any parts. They couldn't find any serial numbers. They couldn't find anything to fill in that void. And this section was right between the laboratory, behind the cockpit, and the leading edge of the right wing. And it was this area that they believe where a bomb had detonated, and it left the 10 by 10 hole. This section also happens to be where Frank's seat was located, row 7. It was a 3-seat group that blew out of this airplane on decompression and the explosion going at the same time. It would be just like you're shot out of a cannon. You're going to leave this airplane. These were the seats located in Snow's Marsh along with the body 300 yards south. This strengthened the theory considerably that the explosion originated under his seat, and he was also the only person in that section. All the others were accounted for at the farm, so he was the only one that at that explosion, when it went off, and out the door he goes. If there had been anybody else around him, they'd have gone too, but they didn't. I feel the explosion and decompression helped propel the seats and Frank out of the fuselage instantly. Now, there's one other thing here to consider. We've had airplanes many times lose major portions of the fuselage. Not many years ago, I believe it was a Hawaii and Aloha Airlines or something to that effect, the 737-200, I believe, jet, that a major portion of the top just blew off. Decompression or pressurization issue, should I say. And I think maybe one or, I don't know, I know one, maybe 2 flight attendants blew out, or 1 or 2 passengers were lost. They flew this airplane all the way back and landed. And I think when it landed and touched down, it sort of buckled, but they made it back. There's been instances of airplanes in World War II with tails almost completely shot off, wings gone. So what I'm saying is this bomb that went off, if it had been anywhere other than where it was at, that airplane possibly would have made it. But because of where it was at, it was as if he knew where to put it. I'm sure he didn't, but I don't know that he didn't. He couldn't have put it in a more precise, deadly place to go off than what he did. Oklahoma Senator Mike Monroney, chairman of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, made a pronouncement that A bomb of some sort caused a mysterious crash of an airliner which killed 34 persons on January 6. According to his testimony, early indications leaned toward wreckage found in the vicinity of Frank's body, referring to the seats, had showed indications could have been caused by an explosion. And now they know that row 7, but without a body, they had theories. They have put this seat where it goes, and where the seat goes is right in that 10 by 10 void. The examination of the corpse revealed a treasure trove of evidence. His body was found to contain many items which were indicative of an explosion according to military experts and analysis: paint, metal, wood, so forth. There was also fragments of steel-colored wire in the right form and a small piece of brass, of all things. There shouldn't have been any brass around an airplane in that area for any reason. Further, in his right hand were traces of manganese dioxide, and that's a substance found in the making of dry cell batteries. And it was found under one of the right triple seats. They installed these seats in the airplane, put it where it should go yet. Don't really know a whole lot more than what's going on other than, well, we know this seat goes here. We know that's where the hole's at. We know something bad took place here. Shortly after that, Hall began smelling rotting flesh. And after an extensive investigation, they found parts of his flesh and bone fragments in the hat rack area, which would have been overhead. I'm telling you, they assembled this airplane. Every nut and bolt that could be found was put back where it went. And a piece of brass similar to a brass retainer plate and a Westclock's Trevette alarm clock and other miscellaneous material. Experts in bomb analysis from the Marine Corps mainly agree his body proved dynamite was used and was likely under his seat. Now, they also know he boarded this airplane in New York carrying a small blue bag, and this blue bag weighed approximately 20 pounds. Well, back in 1960, they didn't open that bag up and look in it. All they needed was the weight. Weight was critical in flying, because it always is, but no investigations about what's in that bag. How much that bag weighed? About 20 pounds, okay. Well, a blue bag. Such a bag was found near him with the bottom out of it. And along the riverside of Curie Beach was found a life jacket that had blown out of the plane. They had a piece of zipper embedded in it that was like that of the blue bag. Traces of nitrate residue, dynamite, was found on this life jacket. Now, you remember this thing took place over the west side of the river. This was found on the east side of the river, but the winds aloft that night at that time were approaching 100 miles an hour, west to east. A strong front was coming through. And so at the explosion, this drifted over to the other side of the river. Ironically, there were pieces of a woman's hat found embedded in his leg. And I think my wife may have said this, but we can only speculate that he used a hat to hide the bomb, which he probably did in this little blue bag. Let's take his hat and put it on top. Nobody's going to look in it anyway. They just want how much does it weigh. Both the CAB and FBI seem to favor the theory that Frank carried the bomb aboard with intentions of crashing into the ocean offshore, because that bomb went off when they took that 200-degree heading. Theoretically, they were offshore, where evidence of a bomb would disappear and life insurance policies would pay. As a lawyer, he would have known about the suicide clause, which prevents the payout if suicide is proven. Friend said he was obsessed with money. At the same time, investigators found that Frank was in muddy water professionally with charges of embezzlement, a huge malpractice facing him, and also a case of $1 million settlement. The conclusion to this, I know it's kind of lengthy, but it is what it is. It was a major catastrophe for this county. In the board's conclusion, that Flight 2511 proceeded in a normal manner without operational difficulty, mechanical failure, or malfunction until shortly after passing the Carolina Beach radio beacon, which was a short distance south of Wilmington. At approximately 2:33, a dynamite charge was exploded. This was derived from the Curie Beach fisherman. It took place right over his head. Initiated by means of a dry cell battery with a passenger cabin and a point beneath the extreme right seat of row number 7. Everything points to the big 10 by 10 void. Here it is. The dynamite explosion severely impaired the structural integrity of the aircraft, and after making a wide descending right turn, they're not positive he was making a descending right turn because the throttles of the engine all indicated operating at, it was called economy mode, or 2240 was the economy power setting at that weight for those engines to get your furthest distance on the least amount of fuel. But regardless, after making a wide descending right turn, it experienced in-flight disintegration and crashed 1.5 miles northwest of Bolivia at 2:38. So you're looking at about a 5-minute time span, roughly. Probable cause, the board determines. You got to remember, probable cause. The board determines that the probable cause of this accident was a detonation of dynamite within the passenger cabin. Well, they haven't proven anything. They know everything. Everything is cut and dried, but they yet didn't know whether it was a case of suicide, murder, or whether it was a case he himself was an unlucky victim and it was a case of murder. That's pretty much how it closed up or wound up and ending. Before I ask you if any questions or whatever, well, let me back up. I have one person here who is a passenger on board the airplane, and he has a tremendous background in aviation. And I can just imagine the terror that went through him. His name was Edward Oric McDonald. He was an American Vice Admiral, and he also was a Medal of Honor recipient. He was born on 13 November 1891, Baltimore, Maryland. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1912. He received the Medal of Honor for actions at the occupation of Veracruz in 1914. The interesting part, he also flew a British-built Sopwith Camel, which was a biplane, off an overhaul gun turret on the battleship USS Texas, and thus became the first man to ever fly an airplane off a battleship. He's buried in Arlington. And before I ask for questions, I got a little thing here my wife put together. I think it'd be good to watch a little 2-minute clip to see a DC-6B the way she was meant to look and perform. Here's a fully restored DC-6, one of the only 2 left in existence flying, I believe, today, and it's registered in Austria and owned by a group called the Flying Bulls. Now, I'm sure you guys, Flying Bulls is a big outfit, and they're in auto racing. They're in everything Flying Bulls, big red Flying Bulls. Anyway, we'll watch this real quick, and then I'll take any questions. Pretty neat. I never had an opportunity to fly something like that, but I think it would have been very enjoyable. Are there any questions I can answer? Yes, sir.
This is the simplest one you have to answer. I'm not sure where Randolph Farm is.
I'm sorry, say again?
Where's the farm at where all the debris field is? Where is it?
Where? It's just west of Bolivia. There's nothing there now, of course. The dirt road is now paved. It's an interconnection between the old 17 and the new 17.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yes, sir. It's just a little small area. Yeah, Tommy?
That would be Frank Randolph's family too. But
That's correct. That's who it was.
American
That's exactly who it was. Frank Randolph.
Randolph. They call it Randolphville.
Mm-mm.
People call it that.
I know it. I know it.
Yeah.
I know it. Yes, sir.
Was his wife on the plane, this Frank guy?
No.
Who by
No, he was a farmer that owned the farm.
and the
Julian Frank.
Oh, Julian Frank? Oh, he was on the airplane. He got on board the airplane in New York
he was
and
by himself, or his wife was with him?
by himself. He was by himself. And it's very difficult to trace back whatever happened about the insurance policy, whatever happened about any of it. But since nothing was proven, I'm sure they paid. I guess they did.
Was the other missing body somebody was sitting near him?
Yes, the other missing body was found at the Randolph farm.
What?
He was the only one found in that area right there, the only thing with that seat. Yeah.
The explosion was at 2:30. Did no other tower know they were missing?
No, well, you see the way that works back then when an airplane takes off out of a long flight like New York, they're pretty much given position reports to give in. Nowadays, they're talking constantly with the radio controller, somebody always. His last communication prior to that was with Washington Center. He probably hadn't talked to anybody for another hour leaving New York Center. But every time he would come over a checkpoint on his map, he would transmit Flight 2511 currently over Newbie intersection, all good. And that's it. Nobody even talked to him.
So Miami wasn't expecting him, and
Yes, and that's what triggered the airline personnel to get there so quickly. The flight became overdue instantly. By 5 o'clock in the morning, he was way overdue. And then they found out that it had already been reported at 7, or they'd been reported later on, a couple hours later, that they found debris from it. Yeah.
So one thing that's interesting about this is they changed flights in New York. So he was originally supposed to be on a.
He was originally supposed to be on a Boeing 707.
Which would have been, if he had set the thing off, it was a timer, right?
Apparently.
So if he had started that timer when he took off in the 707, they would have been much further downrange
Oh yeah, he'd have been well over the ocean.
when it went off. So his plan kind of got thwarted by the fact that he was flying a slower airplane.
May have been. I don't know. They just over Carolina Beach Beacon, which by the way is it's now it's out of operation. It's the strongest beacon in the world, and it's used by airplanes all over the world for navigation. At that point, where he takes up the 200-degree heading, and at 300 knots, it didn't take long to go, and he would have been over the ocean. I don't know when he set the explosion or nothing else, but that's what triggered it.
Like you say, the luckiest people in the world were people that been on the other plane.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Was there any evidence he had any bombing expert, or was he a mechanical guy? Or
Nope. He was a lawyer, and they said he didn't know which end of a screwdriver to use.
pretty unusual that he could pull it off.
Yeah, but he had also, if I'm not mistaken, and I could probably find this, but I read somewhere where he had a book in his house on, and I may be wrong, something in reference to dynamite. That's all.
Question here.
Just to follow up on his question, he had no way of knowing that he was going to end up on that airplane.
No.
You mentioned that you put that bomb, if you put a bomb there, in the perfect location. He was never expected to be on that.
And that was just absolutely happened so.
Right.
That bomb could have been placed anywhere. He would not have known where to put that bomb, I don't believe.
And the statement you had made, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but you said possibly if it had been any other aircraft,
Yeah.
any other location,
Yeah.
that plane may have landed.
Yep.
So again, if he had been on a Boeing 707,
Who knows?
who knows?
It doesn't mention anything about his seat assignment on the Boeing 707. I couldn't find that anywhere. And whenever they boarded the other two airplanes, it was first come, first serve.
Almost got on the Electra.
This DC-6 is a pretty big airplane. It probably carry, 80, 90 people, some configurations, only 34 of them on board. So that stood a good reason why he was by himself, or he intentionally got away from.
Well, I think the Electra, they filled it.
Yeah.
Whoever was left, they ended
Yeah,
up on the
yeah.
DC-6.
Yep, exactly.
So that explosion must have hit that engine? What happened to that engine?
Okay.
It kept running.
The explosion occurred just behind where the wing joins the fuselage, okay? And the explosion was level with the wing, and the explosion went into the wing, and that engine is mounted right at the base of that wing, right where that explosion took off. And that explosion blew out all controls, blew out everything. It basically blew the engine mounts that hold this engine to the wing, to the airframe. Now, all this is connected to what's called the leading edge spar, which is a big main beam going down this engine, which is the strength, the backbone of the whole wing. Well, all this was compromised, and this engine immediately went to trying to tear itself loose until it eventually did. And it was found right there at the wing. Hey, Bob, thank you, man.